The cargo bay doors of the Meridian sealed shut with a heavy clang that echoed through the loading dock of New Geneva Station. Captain Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead and checked his datapad one more time. The delivery was complete, and payment had been transferred to his account. Another successful run to the edge of human space. Another step closer to paying off the ship's debts. Jake walked through the busy corridors of the station, dodging cargo loaders and maintenance bots as they went about their endless work. New Geneva was one of the largest trade hubs in this sector, a massive spinning wheel of metal and glass that housed over 2 million beings from dozens of different species. The air recyclers worked overtime to filter out the mix of atmospheric preferences, creating a slightly metallic taste that all spacers learned to ignore. He was heading toward the Jean Cantina section when he first saw her. The alien woman sat hunched against a wall in one of the darker corridors, 3 small figures pressed close to her side. Her species was unfamiliar to Jake at first glance, but something about her posture spoke of desperation that needed no translation. Her clothing was torn and dirty, and the children beside her looked far too thin. Jake slowed his pace as he approached. The woman looked up at him with large, dark eyes that seemed to hold both hope and fear in equal measure. Her skin had a pale blue tint, and her hair fell in thin strands around a face that might have been beautiful if not marked by exhaustion and worry. The children were clearly hers, sharing the same coloring and features, though their eyes were larger and seemed to take up too much of their small faces. She spoke in a language Jake did not recognize, her voice soft but urgent. A small translator, device clipped to her ragged shirt, crackled to life after a moment, converting her words into rough galactic standard. "Please, sir, I need work. Any work. My children, they are so hungry. I will do anything, clean, carry, repair. Just please. Help us." Jake stopped walking and looked down at the small family. The children stared back at him with those huge eyes, and he could see the sharp angles of hunger in their faces. The youngest, barely more than a toddler, was sucking on what looked like a piece of old cloth. The sight hit Jake like a punch to the gut, reminding him of times from his own childhood when food had been scarce. "What species are you?" Jake asked gently, crouching down to be at eye level with the woman. "Velkin," she replied through the translator. "From the world of Velcaris. It is gone now. The hegemony, they came with their ships and their weapons. We escaped on the last transport, but we have nothing left. No home, no money, no food for the little ones." Jake had heard about Velcaris on the news feeds. The hegemony had claimed the planet for its mineral resources, displacing the entire population with typical efficiency. Millions of Velkins were now scattered across the galaxy, most ending up in refugee camps or worse. The galactic community had expressed the usual concerns and offered the standard aid packages, but individual families like this one often fell through the cracks. "The station authorities won't help?" Jake asked. The woman's translator made a sound that might have been bitter laughter. "They say we are not essential personnel. We get basic air and water, but food costs credits we do not have. The children, they have not eaten in 3 days. I beg in the markets, but most people just walk past. They say it is not their problem." Jake looked around the corridor and saw she was right. Dozens of beings of various species walked by without even glancing at the struggling family. A group of well-dressed Centaurians stepped around them as if they were just another piece of station equipment. 2 human merchants passed by deep in conversation about cargo prices, never noticing the desperate woman and her children. This was normal in galactic society. Displaced persons were common. Refugees from wars and disasters were everywhere, and most civilizations had long ago decided that individual charity was inefficient. The strong survived, and the weak did not. and interfering with that natural process was considered foolish by most species. But Jake was human, and humans had never been good at following that kind of logic. "What kind of work can you do?" he asked. The woman straightened slightly, hope flickering in her eyes. "I was a cargo coordinator on Valkyrus. I can read manifests, organize supplies, operate loading equipment. I am strong. I learn quickly. Before the war, I managed supply lines for the defense forces." Jake made a decision that would change more lives than he could possibly imagine. "I need someone to help organize my cargo holds and manage inventory. The pay isn't much, but it includes food and quarters for you and your children. Are you interested?" The woman stared at him for a long moment, as if she could not believe what she was hearing. Then tears began to flow down her cheeks, and she grabbed Jake's hand with both of hers. "Yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. I will work harder than anyone, I promise. My children will not be trouble. They are good children. They will stay quiet and out of the way." "What are your names?" Jake asked. "I am Zareth," she said, pronouncing it carefully for the translator. "This is Keth, my eldest son. This is Vara, my daughter. And this little one is Zix, my baby." Jake smiled at each of the children in turn. Keth looked to be about 10 in human years, with serious eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. Vara was perhaps 8, with her mother's delicate features, but a determined set to her jaw. Little Zix could not have been more than 4, still clinging to that piece of cloth like a security blanket. "I'm Captain Jake Morrison of the cargo ship Meridian," he said. "Welcome to my crew, Zareth. Let's get you and your children fed and settled in." As they walked toward the docking bay, Jake could feel the stares of other beings watching them. Some looked curious, others disapproving. A Thoraxian merchant he knew slightly made a clicking sound that his translator rendered as mild disgust. A pair of station security officers watched them pass with expressions that suggested they thought Jake was making a mistake. None of that mattered. Jake had made his choice based on something deeper than galactic social norms or economic efficiency. He had made it based on the simple human belief that when someone asks for help, especially someone with hungry children, you help if you can. What he did not know was that this single act of compassion would ripple outward like a stone thrown into still water, eventually reaching every corner of human space and beyond. All he knew was that there were 3 hungry children who would sleep with full bellies tonight, and their mother would have work and dignity instead of desperation. Sometimes the most important moments in history begin with the simplest human kindness. The Meridian pulled away from New Geneva Station, with its newest crew members settled in the small cabin that Jake had cleared out for them. It was barely large enough for 4 people, but it was clean and warm, and most importantly, it was theirs. Zareth had cried again when she saw the beds, real beds with actual mattresses and clean sheets. Her children had explored every corner of their new home with the wide-eyed wonder of youngsters who had not had a safe place to sleep in months. Jake's crew had mixed reactions to the new arrivals. First Officer Lisa Park had pulled him aside. Before departure, her expression serious. "Captain, I understand wanting to help, but we're not equipped to handle refugees. Our food supplies are calculated down to the last meal, and our life support systems are already running near capacity." Jake respected Lisa's concerns because they came from a place of genuine worry rather than prejudice. She was a good officer who thought about practical problems, which was exactly why he needed her as his second in command. "We'll manage, Lisa. We've run with extra passengers before when we've had to evacuate colonists from disaster zones." "Those were short-term emergencies," Lisa replied. "This feels different, more permanent." She was right, and Jake knew it. He was not just giving the Velkin family passage to another station. He was offering them a new life, and that came with responsibilities he had not fully considered. But when he thought about little Zick sucking on that piece of cloth, or the hollow look in Keth's too serious eyes, he knew he could not have made any other choice. Engineer Bob Chun was more direct in his objections. "Jake, our recycling systems are already working overtime. 4 more people means 20% more strain on everything from water processing to waste management. We're going to have to upgrade half our equipment." "Then we upgrade," Jake said simply. "Send me a list of what we need, and I'll find the credits." Bob stared at him for a moment, then shrugged. "Your ship, your choice. But don't blame me when we're all breathing recycled air that tastes like a Martian garbage dump." Navigation officer Amy Rodriguez had a different perspective. She had grown up in the asteroid mining colonies, where community survival often depended on helping your neighbors. "I think it's the right thing to do, Captain. Besides, that woman knows cargo systems. She might actually make us more efficient." The first test of that theory came 3 days out from New Geneva. Jake was reviewing shipping manifests when Zareth approached him in the cargo bay. She had been studying the layout of their holds and had some suggestions for better organization. Her ideas were not just good, they were brilliant. She understood how to maximize space usage while maintaining easy access to priority items. "Where did you learn to do this?" Jake asked as he watched her rearrange a section of medical supplies. Velcarus was a trading world before it was a military target, Zareth explained through her translator. "I manage supply flows for our entire continental defense network." Efficiency was the difference between victory and defeat. Within a week, Zareth had reorganized their entire cargo system. Loading and unloading times were cut in half, and they could now carry 15% more freight in the same space. Jake realized that he had not just gained a crew member. He had gained someone who could make his operation significantly more profitable. But the real changes happened in the small moments between work shifts. Amy started teaching basic Galactic, standard to the children using educational programs from the ship's computer. Little Zix was a quick learner, picking up new words every day and chattering happily in a mix of Vulcan and Standard that made everyone smile. Bob found himself explaining basic engineering concepts to Keth, who showed an unusual interest in how the ship's systems worked. The boy had a natural understanding of mechanical relationships that impressed the veteran engineer. "Kid's got good instincts," Bob told Jake. "Might make a decent engineer someday if he gets proper training." Vara was quieter than her brothers, but she spent hours in the navigation section with Amy, learning about star charts and hyperspace routes. She had an intuitive grasp of three-dimensional spatial relationships that Amy found remarkable. "She sees patterns in space that take most people years to understand," Amy reported. "It's like she was born to navigate." The biggest change was in the ship's atmosphere, literally and figuratively. Lisa had been worried about life support strain, but somehow the recycling systems seemed to be working better than ever. It took Jake a while to realize why. Zareth had noticed inefficiencies in their air and water processing that none of them had caught. Her reorganization of those systems had actually improved their capacity. More importantly, the ship felt more like a home than it ever had before. The sound of children laughing in the corridors, the smell of Vulcan cooking coming from their quarters, the sight of Zareth working alongside his crew as an equal rather than a passenger, all of it created a warmth that Jake had not realized was missing. Word of Jake's decision spread through the loose network of human cargo haulers and merchant captains who worked the outer systems. The story grew in the telling, as stories always do. Some versions made Jake out to be a saint, others painted him as a fool who would bankrupt himself helping strays. But the core truth remained the same. A human captain had seen a desperate family and offered them more than charity. He had offered them dignity and purpose. Other human ships began reporting similar incidents. Captain Steve Williams of the freighter. Northstar took on a family of Andromedan refugees after a mining accident left them homeless. Captain Nancy Foster of the merchant vessel Wanderer hired a group of displaced Thoraxians to help with her cargo operations. Each story inspired others, creating a chain reaction of compassion that spread across human space. The Galactic Trade Commission started, receiving complaints from other species about human ships disrupting established protocols for handling displaced persons. The Centaurian Trade Confederation formally protested that humans were interfering with natural selection processes. The hegemony filed a complaint that human refugee assistance was encouraging unproductive population elements. To resist proper resettlement procedures, Admiral Helen Cross at Earth Command received the formal complaints during her weekly briefing. Her aide, Commander Paul Grant, summarized the issues with barely concealed amusement. Basically, Admiral, the other species are upset that our merchant captains keep helping refugees instead of leaving them to starve. Admiral Cross was a veteran of 3 wars and had commanded fleets that defended human space against multiple threats. She was not easily impressed or intimidated. "What's our official response supposed to be, Commander?" "The Centaurians are requesting that we issue orders forbidding our civilian captains from taking on refugees without proper authorization. They claim it's disrupting established galactic social order." Admiral Cross leaned back in her chair and considered this for a moment. Then she smiled, and Commander Grant recognized the expression that had terrified enemy commanders across 3 star systems. "Draft a response, Commander. Tell the Centaurians that we appreciate their concern for galactic social order. Then inform them that humans don't do natural selection. We do something better. We do human." The response became legendary among human spacers within days of its transmission. Copies were shared on every human vessel, posted in cantinas from Earth to the Outer Rim, and eventually translated into dozens of languages. It became a rallying cry for what people started calling the human way of dealing with galactic problems. Back on the Meridian, Jake was unaware that his simple act of kindness had become the center of a growing movement. He was too busy dealing with the practical reality of his expanded crew. Zareth had proven herself invaluable. Her children were integrating well with the ship's routine, and their next cargo run was shaping up to be their most profitable ever thanks to her efficiency improvements. But he was beginning to understand that he had not just rescued a family from starvation. He had gained something precious that no amount of credits could buy. He had gained a crew that functioned like a family, and a ship that felt like a real home for the first time in his career as a captain. 3 months after leaving New Geneva Station, the Meridian had become something unprecedented in Jake's years as a cargo hauler. The ship ran with an efficiency that amazed him daily, and the atmosphere aboard felt more like a close-knit family than a commercial crew. Zarath had not just integrated into their operations, she had transformed them. Her reorganization of their cargo systems had increased their carrying capacity by 20% while reducing loading times by almost half. They were completing runs faster and carrying more freight, which meant higher profits for everyone. But more than that, her tactical knowledge from her days coordinating Vulcan defense forces had proven invaluable in ways Jake never expected. Test came when they were approaching the Outer Rim with a cargo of medical supplies bound for the mining colony of New Pittsburgh. The proximity alarms started screaming just as they dropped out of hyperspace, and Jake's blood ran cold as he saw 3 ships moving to intercept them. Pirates, flying modified fighters with their identification transponders dark. "Evasive maneuvers," Jake ordered, but he knew it was hopeless. The Meridian was built for cargo, not speed, and 3 fighters could run circles around them. That was when Zareth spoke up from her position at the cargo control station. "Captain, may I suggest a different approach?" Jake was about to tell her to strap in, and let the crew handle the emergency when something in her voice stopped him. There was no fear there, only calm calculation. "What do you have in mind?" "Pirates expect merchants to run or surrender immediately," she said, her fingers dancing over her control panel. "They do not expect tactical thinking. Our cargo bay. Doors can be opened and closed rapidly. Yes? Yes. But what does that have to do with anything?" Zarath's next words were spoken with the confidence of someone who had once coordinated the defense of an entire planet. "We are carrying medical supplies, including emergency oxygen canisters. If we vent them at precisely the right moment, while performing a specific maneuver, we can create a debris field that will confuse their sensors and give us an opportunity to escape." Jake stared at her for a moment, then made a decision that went against every instinct he had developed as a cargo captain. "Lisa, transfer tactical control to Zarath. Do exactly what she says." What followed was the most precisely executed escape maneuver Jake had ever witnessed. Zarath coordinated their movements with split-second timing, using their cargo as improvised countermeasures while guiding them through a complex series of turns that took advantage of the local asteroid field. The pirates found themselves chasing shadows while the Meridian slipped away using a route that only someone with extensive tactical training could have plotted. "Where did you learn to do that?" Amy asked in amazement once they were safely in. "Hyperspace. Velcaris was invaded 3 times before the hegemony finally conquered us," Zarath replied simply. "I spent years learning how to make cargo transports survive in hostile space. It was my job to ensure that supplies reached our forces, no matter what obstacles stood in the way." Bob shook his head in wonder. "And here I thought we just hired someone to organize our storage containers." The story of their escape spread quickly through the merchant networks. Other captains started seeking out Zarath's advice on cargo efficiency and security procedures. Her children, meanwhile, continued to amaze the crew with their rapid adaptation to ship life. Keth had become Bob's unofficial apprentice, showing an intuitive understanding of engineering that impressed everyone who worked with him. The boy could diagnose problems with ship systems by listening to the subtle changes in their operating sounds. Bob had started teaching him advanced maintenance procedures that were usually reserved for certified engineers. Vara had developed into Amy's prize student in navigation, displaying a natural talent for 3-dimensional thinking that was rare even among professional navigators. She could plot hyperspace routes in her head that took most people hours to calculate using computers. Amy had begun letting her handle routine navigation tasks under supervision. Even little Zix had found his place aboard the ship. His cheerful personality and endless curiosity had made him everyone's favorite, and his rapid mastery of Galactic Standard had made him an unofficial translator when they encountered other Velkin refugees at various stations, because they were encountering more refugees all the time. Jake's example had inspired dozens of other human captains to start taking on displaced families, and the network of assistance was growing rapidly. What had started as individual acts of charity was becoming something larger and more organized. Captain Steve Williams contacted Jake during a supply stop at Frontier Station. His own Andromedan refugees had proven just as valuable as Zarath and her children, bringing technical skills that had improved his ship's performance dramatically. "We should coordinate our efforts," Steve suggested. "Share information about which stations need help, which refugees have useful skills, that kind of thing." The idea grew from there. Within weeks, human merchant captains were sharing data about refugee populations, available positions, and successful integration strategies. They called it the Human Relief Collective, though it was less an organization than a loose network of ship captains who believed in helping those who needed it. The galactic community was not pleased with these developments. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to address what they officially termed irregular human interference in established displacement protocols, but what everyone understood to be the growing human practice of actually helping refugees. Instead of ignoring them, Representative Faxon of the hegemony stood before the assembled delegates, his mechanical voice conveying the cold logic that had made his species the dominant military power in the galaxy. The humans are disrupting natural selection processes that have maintained galactic stability for millennia. By interfering with the elimination of weak populations, they are creating dependencies that drain resources from productive members of society. The Centaurian delegate, a tall being with crystalline features that reflected the chamber's lights, added her support. Centaurian economic models clearly demonstrate that resource allocation to non-productive individuals reduces overall efficiency by an average of 12%. Human interference is damaging the economic stability of multiple sectors. Other species voiced similar concerns. The Theraxians worried about overcrowding on trade stations. The Andromedans presented statistical analyses showing that refugee assistance created long-term resource drains. Even some human colonies had expressed concerns about the increasing numbers of displaced persons seeking sanctuary in human space. Ambassador Claire Watson stood to address the Council on behalf of Earth and the human colonies. She was a veteran diplomat who had negotiated treaties with dozens of species, but she had never faced a challenge quite like this one. The entire galactic community was essentially asking humanity to stop being human. Honored delegates, she began. I understand your concerns about resource allocation and economic efficiency. These are valid considerations in any interstellar community. However, I believe there is a fundamental misunderstanding about human motivations and methods. The hegemony representative's mechanical voice cut through the chamber. Explain how emotional responses to individual suffering can be considered logical policy. Ambassador Watson smiled, and something in that expression reminded every being present that humans had not achieved their position in galactic society by being weak or naive. We measure our success differently than you do. You judge a civilization by its efficiency, its military strength, its economic output. We judge ours by whether children go to bed hungry, whether families are separated by circumstances beyond their control, whether the strong use their advantages to help or to exploit. She gestured to the data displays showing refugee populations across the galaxy. You see numbers that represent resource drains and inefficient population distributions. We see individuals with skills, knowledge, and potential who are being wasted because no one is willing to give them a chance to contribute. The Andromedan Science Collective's representative spoke up, his synthesized voice carrying genuine curiosity. Your statistical models suggest this approach should fail. Resources are finite. Helping the weak should logically result in overall population decline as resources are diverted from productive uses. That would be true if resources were truly finite, Ambassador Watson replied. But they're not. When you feed a hungry child, you don't lose food permanently. You create an adult who can produce more food. When you give work to a displaced person, you don't lose efficiency. You gain a worker who is grateful and motivated to excel. Our refugees aren't draining our resources. They're multiplying them. The chamber fell silent as delegates considered this perspective. It went against the fundamental assumptions that had guided galactic civilization for thousands of years. The idea that helping the weak could actually strengthen the whole was so alien to most species that they struggled to process it. Representative Faxon's response was predictably logical. Even if your theory were correct, which our models indicate it is not, such policies encourage weakness and dependency among populations that should be developing self-sufficiency. The attack on New Harmony Colony came without warning, just as the hegemony had planned it. Jake was delivering a cargo of construction materials to help expand the colony's refugee housing when the first explosions lit up the morning sky. Meridian had just finished unloading in the main settlement when proximity alarms began screaming across the entire colony. Jake rushed to the command center where Colony Administrator Corinne Bell was coordinating the defense. Her face was grim as she studied the tactical displays showing multiple hegemony assault ships approaching from 3 different vectors. "They're not just attacking," she told Jake. "They're targeting the refugee sectors specifically." The message was clear and brutal in its simplicity. The hegemony had grown tired of human interference with their population management policies. By attacking colonies where refugees had been integrated, they were sending a signal that could not be misunderstood. Stop helping the displaced, or face the consequences. New Harmony was home to over 50,000 colonists and nearly 20,000 refugees from a dozen different species. The colony's defenses were designed to handle pirates and raiders, not a coordinated military assault by one of the galaxy's major powers. They had perhaps 6 hours before the hegemony forces reached the surface. Jake found Zareth and her children in the refugee quarters, helping to organize an evacuation of the most vulnerable families. Her face was calm, but he could see the terrible recognition in her eyes. She had lived through this before on Valkyris, and she knew exactly what the hegemony did to populations they considered expendable. "We need to get you and the children out of here," Jake said. "The Meridian can carry maybe 200 people if we strip out all the cargo space. I can have you safe on a neutral station within 12 hours. Zareth looked at him for a long moment, then at her children who were helping younger refugee kids pack their few belongings. Keth was carrying a Theraxian child who was too small to walk quickly. Vara was translating evacuation instructions for a group of elderly Andromedans. Little Zix was handing out food rations from the emergency supplies with the serious concentration of someone who understood the gravity of the situation. "No," Zareth said finally. "We stay." Jake stared at her in shock. "Zareth, you know what the hegemony does to refugee populations. You've seen it before. I can get you out of here." "You gave us food when we were starving," she replied, her voice steady through the translator. "You gave us work when we were useless. You gave us dignity when we had lost everything. You made us family when we were alone. Now we give you our strength." Before Jake could argue further, Zareth was moving through the refugee quarters with the efficient authority of someone who had once coordinated planetary defenses. She spoke to the various refugee leaders in their own languages, her translator, working overtime to convey her message to multiple species simultaneously. What happened next would be studied in military academies for decades afterward. The refugee population of New Harmony, rather than fleeing in panic, began organizing itself into a defense force under Zareth's direction. They had skills that the colonists lacked, knowledge gained from surviving the destruction of their own worlds, and most importantly, they had something to fight for. The Velkin refugees knew hegemony tactics from bitter experience. The Andromedan refugees brought technical knowledge that allowed them to improvise weapons and defensive systems from colony equipment. The Theraxian refugees contributed their natural strength and endurance. Even the smaller species found ways to contribute, using their size to move through ventilation systems and tight spaces that humans could not access. Keth surprised everyone by demonstrating an intuitive understanding of defensive engineering. Working with Bob Chun, who had refused Jake's order to evacuate with the ship, the boy helped redesign the colony's power grid to create redundant systems that would be nearly impossible for the hegemony to disable completely. Vara used her navigation skills to plot evacuation routes for non-combatants that took advantage of the colony's natural cave systems. Her three-dimensional thinking allowed her to map paths through the underground networks that even the colony's own surveys had missed. Little Zix became a communications runner, his small size and quick reflexes making him perfect for carrying messages between defensive positions when electronic Communications were jammed. The first wave of the hegemony assault hit the colony's outer perimeter 6 hours after the initial alarm. The attackers expected to find panicked civilians fleeing in disorder. Instead, they encountered coordinated resistance from defenders who knew exactly what they were fighting for. Jake found himself commanding a mixed unit of human colonists and refugee volunteers, using tactics that Zareth had developed based on her experience defending Velcaris. The strategy was unlike anything in standard military manuals. Instead of trying to hold fixed positions, they used the colony's infrastructure as a three-dimensional battlefield, moving through buildings and tunnels to strike at the attackers from unexpected directions. The hegemony forces were equipped with superior weapons and armor, but they were trained to fight conventional battles against predictable opponents. They were not prepared for a defense that treated every corridor, every room, every maintenance shaft as a potential ambush site. The turning point came when Keth's modifications to the power grid allowed the defenders to selectively shut down different sections of the colony, plunging attacking forces into darkness while keeping their own positions illuminated. The hegemony troops found themselves fighting blind against opponents who moved through the colony like they had lived there for years. But it was the psychological impact that truly defeated the hegemony assault. Their soldiers were used to facing desperate refugees who fled or surrendered when faced with superior force. They were not prepared to fight people who had found something worth dying for, something that made them willing to stand and fight against impossible odds. The sight of human colonists and alien refugees fighting side by side, protecting each other's children and defending each other's homes, created a kind of resistance that the hegemony had never encountered before. Their tactical doctrine had no provisions for dealing with an enemy that grew stronger when threatened instead of weaker. The battle lasted 18 hours. When it was over, the hegemony forces had withdrawn, leaving behind their dead and wounded. They had achieved none of their objectives and had suffered casualties that would take months to replace. More importantly, they had learned that human refugee integration policies were not a sign of weakness to be exploited, but a source of strength that made human colonies significantly harder to conquer. Jake stood in the colony's command center, looking at the damage reports and casualty lists. They had lost good people, both colonists and refugees, but they had won something more valuable than a single battle. They had proven that the human way of building communities could survive the ultimate test. Zareth approached him, her arm in a sling from a wound she had received while defending the communication center. Her children were with her, tired but unharmed, still helping with the cleanup efforts. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Jake asked. "You're the one who organized the defense. You're the one who turned our refugees into our strongest defenders." "No," Zareth replied. "Thank you for showing us that we were not refugees. Thank you for teaching us that we were colonists who just had not found our colony yet." Jake looked around the command center, where humans and aliens worked together to restore their damaged home. Children of multiple species played together in the corners while their parents planned reconstruction efforts. The sight filled him with something he had never quite felt before: the absolute certainty that humanity was doing something right in a galaxy that often seemed determined to do everything wrong. The news of New Harmony's successful defense spread across human space faster than any official communication could travel. The story grew in the telling, as stories always do, but the core truth remained powerful. When threatened, human colonies defended by integrated refugee populations had proven stronger than anyone had imagined possible. Other species began to take notice. The Andromedan Science Collective started studying the New Harmony defense, trying to understand how emotional bonds could translate into tactical advantages. The Theraxian Trade Federation began quietly experimenting with refugee integration programs of their own. Most importantly, The hegemony began to realize that their strategy of using refugee crises to destabilize human colonies was not just failing. It was making their targets stronger. For the first time in their history as a galactic power, they found themselves facing an opponent that grew more dangerous when attacked rather than weaker. The human way was no longer just an idealistic approach to galactic problems. It had become a proven strategy for survival and success in a hostile universe. 6 months after the Battle of New Harmony, the Galactic Council chambers had never seen anything quite like the scene unfolding before them. Captain Jake Morrison sat at the witness table, no longer the simple cargo hauler who had picked up a desperate family at New Geneva Station. Beside him sat Zareth, wearing the crisp uniform of a certified first officer, her rank earned through competence and courage rather than charity. The transformation in both of them was remarkable, but it was nothing compared to the changes that had swept across the galaxy since their story began. What had started as one man's simple act of kindness had become a revolution that was reshaping how entire civilizations thought about strength, survival, and success. Ambassador Claire Watson stood before the assembled delegates, presenting evidence that would have been impossible to imagine just a year before. The data displays showed refugee integration statistics from across human space, and the numbers told a story that challenged every assumption the galactic community had held about displaced populations. The results speak for themselves, Ambassador, Watson said, gesturing to the holographic charts floating above the council floor. Human colonies with integrated refugee populations show 23% higher economic growth, 15% lower crime rates, and 31% better defensive capabilities than colonies without refugee integration programs. The Andromedan Science Collective's representative, a being whose crystalline form reflected the chamber's lights in shifting patterns, spoke with genuine puzzlement. These statistics should be impossible. Our mathematical models predict that resource allocation to non-productive populations should result in overall decline, not improvement. Jake had been asked to testify at the practical realities of refugee integration, and he found himself addressing beings whose civilizations are thousands of years older than humanity. With respect, you're starting from the wrong assumption. Refugees aren't non-productive. They're people with skills and knowledge who just need an opportunity to use them. He gestured toward Zareth. When I met her, your systems classified her as a resource drain, but she had coordinated supply lines for an entire planetary defense network. Her expertise has improved the efficiency of every human cargo operation that's adopted her methods. We didn't lose resources by helping her. We gained capabilities we didn't even know we needed. The hegemony representative, his mechanical voice as emotionless as ever, attempted to challenge the human position. Individual cases prove nothing. Statistical analysis requires large sample sizes to demonstrate meaningful patterns. That was when Zareth stood to address the council, her translator converting her words into the formal tones appropriate for diplomatic discourse. Representative Faxon, you speak of statistics, but you ignore the most important data. Before the humans found us, my children were dying. Now Keth is studying advanced engineering at the Academy on Earth. Vara has been accepted into the Galactic Navigation Institute. Zix speaks 4 languages and wants to become a diplomat like Ambassador Watson. She paused, looking around the chamber at delegates who represented species that had written off her family as expendable. You calculated our value as 0 because we had no resources, no status, no power. The humans calculated our value as infinite because we were people who needed help. Which calculation proved more accurate? The silence that followed her words was profound. Representatives who had spent centuries believing in the cold logic of survival of the fittest were confronted with evidence that their entire philosophical framework might be fundamentally flawed at the Raxian trade federations. Delegate was the first to break the silence. We have conducted preliminary experiments with refugee integration programs based on human methods. Early results suggest significant improvements in colony productivity and social stability. We would like to request technical assistance in expanding these programs. The admission sent shockwaves through the chamber. The Thoraxians were known for their rigid adherence to tradition and their suspicion of foreign ideas. If they were adopting human refugee policies, it meant the evidence was too compelling to ignore. Other species began to speak up with similar requests. The Centauran Trade Confederation wanted to study human integration techniques. The Free World's Alliance was interested in refugee assistance coordination protocols. Even some of the more isolationist species expressed cautious interest in learning more about human approaches to displaced populations. The Hegemony representative made one final attempt to maintain the old order. These developments represent dangerous sentimentality that will ultimately weaken galactic civilization. Emotional responses to individual suffering cannot be the basis for sound policy. Ambassador Watson's response would be quoted in diplomatic schools for generations to come. Representative Thaxon, you're absolutely correct that our policies are based on emotional responses. We feel anger when we see injustice. We feel sorrow when we see suffering. We feel joy when we see people succeed. Those emotions don't make us weak, they make us human. And being human, we've learned, means recognizing that the strength of a civilization is measured not by how efficiently it discards the inconvenient, but by how effectively it helps everyone reach their potential. The formal vote that followed was unprecedented in Galactic Council history. For the first time, a majority of member species approved a resolution encouraging rather than restricting refugee assistance programs. The Human Relief Collective was officially recognized as a legitimate humanitarian organization, and its methods were recommended for study by all member civilizations. But the real victory was not in the council chambers. It was in the thousands of success stories playing out across the galaxy as other species began to understand what humans had known instinctively, that helping others was not a zero-sum game. Captain Steve Williams had expanded his operations to include 3 ships, all crewed by mixed human and refugee teams that were setting new efficiency records throughout their sector. Captain Nancy Foster had established a training program that taught refugee integration techniques to other merchant captains. The network that had started with Jake's simple act of kindness now included thousands of ships and millions of people. Changes went far beyond practical improvements in trade and defense. Something fundamental had shifted in how galactic civilization understood itself. The idea that strength came from helping rather than discarding, that diversity was an advantage rather than a complication, that emotional bonds created practical benefits rather than operational weaknesses. These concepts were spreading from species to species like a virus of compassion. Jake Morrison, who had never intended to change anything beyond one family's circumstances, found himself at the center of a transformation that historians would later call the Great Awakening. But he was too busy with practical matters to pay much attention to historical significance. The Meridian was now the flagship of a fleet of refugee assistance vessels, but it remained a working cargo ship. Jake still took contracts, still delivered freight, still worried about fuel costs and maintenance schedules. The difference was that his crew had grown into something that resembled a small community more than a commercial operation. Zareth had become more than his first officer. She was his partner in building something new. Her children were thriving in ways that would have been impossible if they had remained refugees. Keth was designing improvements to ship systems that were being adopted throughout human space. Vara was planning navigation routes for refugee resettlement operations that spanned multiple sectors. Zix had become the unofficial ambassador to other refugee children, helping them adapt to their new lives with the patience and understanding that only someone who had been through the same experience could provide. a final scene of this chapter. In galactic history took place not in the council chambers or the command centers, but in a small communication booth on Frontier Station. Jake was reviewing shipping manifests when his personal communicator chimed with an incoming message from an unknown sender. The face that appeared on the screen was young and nervous, with the distinctive crystalline features of a Centaurian. She wore the uniform of a junior cargo officer, and her voice carried the uncertainty of someone asking for help for the first time in her life. Captain Morrison, my name is Crystal Song of the merchant vessel Star Dancer. I've heard about your methods for helping displaced persons. There's a family here at our station, Andromedan refugees from the mining disaster at Kepler 7. They have 3 children, and they're asking for work, but my captain says it's not our problem. She paused, clearly struggling with concepts that went against everything her species had taught her about efficient resource management. I keep thinking about the reports from New Harmony, about how your refugees became your strongest defenders. These people have skills we could use, and their children look so hungry. I think I want to try the human way, but I don't know how to convince my captain. Jake smiled as he recorded his response. Officer Song, tell your captain that helping them isn't about charity, it's about common sense. You're not taking on Urban. You're gaining crew members who will work harder and more loyally than anyone you could hire. And if that doesn't convince,